name is Carsten Lehmann. I'm the developer of the Domino JNA project, C API development for Java developers, and looking forward to get some feedback for our efforts regarding open source.
My name is Roberto Mazzoni. I'm at the University of Zurich in the IT department, heading the user services and the collaboration stack at the university based on under our department in my group.
And I am Jesse Gallagher. I'm a Java developer, and I'm also on the OpenNTF board and act as the IP manager there.
Okay, my name is Jan Waldman. I work as a business development manager for Czech-Belgian company Whitesoft. It's your business partner. And as my other side job, I'm an assistant professor at the University of West Bohemia at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering.
Yeah, I'm Bill Malczewski, and I've been working with Linux and Unix for about 32 years, and been in the community since '93, using Nodes Domino and open source, and worked with IBM and 2 Redbooks for Linux, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, everyone. So earlier this year, around April time, Jason tasked me with setting up the HCL open source project office. So HCL has historically been a company that's done more consulting work, and so there hasn't really been much involvement in open source, but that's definitely changing, and Jason is very keen for that, and we've been fortunate enough to have the backing from Darren Oberst to do that. So my task over the last few months has been putting together the processes, identifying what we want to open source, setting up a website, setting up all the infrastructure and applications for managing all of that as well. So we've already released some open source already. Let's just load the rest of them. So we're starting quietly at the moment. We've only been releasing open source for probably since June. We had our first cloud pack, which was a requirement there. And it's only really in the last month that we've had other projects out. So we've got a closed source NPM project from, I can't remember which part of the business that was from, but we've had a number of open source projects. We've had a number of samples released, a couple of documentation areas, one that's submitted and not yet approved, and one that's been approved. And we've got 6 external open source projects that we're contributing back to. So things like Ambassador and Nscripton, amongst others there. And also this week, I've been contacted by the connections team who want to open source connections Ansible automation scripts, so they will be coming as well. And hot off the press, as Jason has been announcing this week, we've got a GitHub repo set up. We've got our first visible projects there, and you'll see one that's being developed by the artist team, but not yet public on HCL Iterate Loop. But we've got the app dev pack samples, thanks to Dan de Montville releasing that earlier this week, or it might have been at the end of last week. And as Jason announced, the Voltamex Lotus Script toolkit. Also, obviously with HCL and as an OpenNTF board member myself since 2013, there's OpenNTF there as well. And just to highlight that, as well as the projects there, we've got code there, we've got code snippets, We've got wikis, which will be expanding into the admin area as well over the coming months. Collaboration today is also under the auspices of OpenNTF, and we have some great people who are keeping the blogs curated and exposed there. So every blog post that goes onto there gets curated by people within the OpenNTF community who are choosing and identifying that they are that those blogs are specifically for these products. And we also have the webinars as well. We've got the next webinar next week, is it, Jesse? The 22nd, I believe.
The 19th.
19th. And do you just want to talk about the topic for that?
That's our Docker one, right?
Yeah.
So that will be our introduction to Docker and why it is useful. It's intended to be kind of, a lot of the Docker presentations that generally come out of, this week or others will be, here's the end result of your Kubernetes cluster and all that stuff. This will be more of like, what is it? Why is it important? How can you get started with it? So this is kind of a step one, get your feet wet with it kind of topic. So hopefully that will be of interest.
Yeah. And the following on, the next webinar from that on the 17th of December will be on the VaultMX Lotus Script Toolkit as well. So that's also going to be a lot of interest as well, hopefully. So on to our discussions. So first question that I'd like to ask the panel to their opinions on is back probably even as recently as about a decade ago, open source consumption was something that companies often shied away from. Now it's the case that most software that's released has at least some open source components in it. What do you think are the benefits and the pitfalls of using open source, and how can companies best manage them?
I can offer something. Are you going to ask specific people, or do you want us to jump in? How do you want to handle this part?
Yeah, just jump in. Yes, yeah.
All right, well, I can start if you'd like. The benefits clearly is that they fill a void, and many of these applications in open source fill a void. They're very reliable, and they can get fixes very quickly. So much faster than, say, Microsoft does with Windows. Linux and Red Hat can provide fixes and turnarounds generally much quicker, particularly for vulnerabilities. And so that's very attractive for companies, particularly the reliability model. I have a slide in one of my decks where I had a Linux server in production that was running Domino 853, and it was up for about 3,200 days continuous without any downtime. And I patched everything but the kernel, and it was running fine, and didn't have to reboot it, and it was just up, and I just patched Domino as needed. And it was zero downtime. So that's very difficult to do with other products. And then you look at the pitfalls. You need a clear way to install a lot of these products, and that becomes if it's difficult to install, then that becomes a pitfall, and people also feel that they don't have the knowledge. And sometimes the lack of knowledge with an open source product in terms of how it runs or running internals can be a detriment, creates a fear factor, even if it's artificial. So you want to provide a clear way, and a lot of open source developers may have the time to do documentation, but at least a clear way to get people in the door so they feel comfortable using it and make it easy to install.
Thanks.
So maybe I would add that I think there are many flavors of open source. And obviously, it does not mean open source, does not mean for free. So I would say that it also that you have to align your open source strategy with your business model. That if it matches together, then it works. If it does not, you are in the trouble.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's adding to what Bill and Jan said. You should have some knowledge on installing it and also on even running it, especially if you build services on it. If you can do it, if you can manage it, then you have really advantages to do so. You have also the awareness, and you know what you are running when. And if not, it's still not a reason not to using open source, because you have companies around that will help you running open source products for your site.
Thanks.
So I think that, yeah, I think it runs the gamut as far as, because open source is broad, because, small projects are open source, giant operating systems and tool sets are open source. And so it'll kind of run the gamut as far as like what it is you're looking for and what you're looking to do with it. From my perspective, if I want to do something, I look for an open source version first, and then failing that, I might look into proprietary ones. So like, and it depends a lot on like what you're going for. So for example, say you're using, say you want to develop your app and you want to choose your UI toolkit. If you choose a closed-sourced one, the things you might get out of that would be integration with if you're already using a closed-source platform, vendor support by default, and ideally faster movement and immediate responses. However, if it falls out of the vendor's favor, you can't work with the source. There's not necessarily going to be a community bolstering it. That said, if you say, I'm going to find an open source thing, and the tool that you find to solve your problem has one person doing it, the last update was 10 months ago, there's a giant issue list, like that's not necessarily going to be better. You might want to go to a company that has a product that they can field and say, we are supporting this, we will take your money and in exchange give you a supported product rather than a when I want to. And so this stuff runs the gamut. Like, you're not going to get, like, if your choice is between Solaris and Linux, the only reason you choose Solaris is if you already chose Solaris, But if your choice is between, say a, multi-platform app dev environment, you have your choices there where, like, the proprietary ones may be better developed, they may not be, it depends. It goes all over the place, essentially, and that's why I say, I look at open source first because that's preferable. If it's compatible, it's open source, I can work with it if I need to. There's probably going to be a community if it's a big project. So, like React, something like that. Open source, large project. And also, there are presumably companies that will take your money to support it. That happens with Linux. That happens with related open source tools. So, for example, if your app server is open source, I use Open Liberty all the time. It's open source, but IBM will take lots of my money if I want them to support it. I don't have to, but like that's kind of the best of both, where the code is open source. I can solve all my own problems if I want to and can. Otherwise, I have this company to back it. So it's a case-by-case thing. It's not just like open source good, open source bad. It's really like what you want. But I'd say prioritize open source because you have the code, you have this option, you have probably a community. But then, you always just have to weigh it on a case-by-case basis as far as what you want to do and what the options are.
Yeah, Jesse, you mentioned vendor support, and you have still community support or full community support on the open source platform. And often I see vendor support you get if the vendor really has interest in your case. In a community approach, probably you get the better support or the better feedback and questions you have, then probably it can be that you can really have the better support, better feedback on open source product because it's a community behind who is all interested to run and to build products that are running for everyone.
Maybe I want to jump in a little bit, talk about pitfalls here, because there is, for me, sometimes a complete misunderstanding about open source. Sometimes people glorify open source as the solution for everything, but to be honest, and I'm chairman of OpenNTF, and I have to be a huge fan of open source, and I am a huge fan of open source, but you have to manage open source as a company. You have to teach your employees how to use open source, what license type they should use for open source, what dependencies they are inheriting. There was the other day a very nice post from a blogger who was very engaged at the Node.js community, and he explained how he can, with a simple util that he's providing as open source, inject code into a lot, millions of projects that will harm people. So open source is not the salvation of all our problems, or open source has to be managed carefully. And I see all the benefits of a community that is providing help. I see the benefits of using open source as a vendor to teach the people how to use your product the right way. That was in the XPage days one of the approaches to tell everybody how to use XPage the right way. But what I see is also a lack of understanding what open source really means, what the license types are meaning, what dependencies you are taking into your project, how careful you should select the projects that you are using. And only because it's available as open source, and especially in the Node community, you can type in npm install and whatever project you want. It doesn't mean that it's well designed, well crafted, and so on. It's only, in short, open source. So it's not a question if, then what, and at the what side. I think we all need to be a little bit more, in a positive way, skeptic that we honor the right people and honor the right products and honor the right projects, and give them the credits for what they are doing. And also, as I said, teach your employees how to use open source the right way, understand what it's meaning.
And I think that feeds perfectly into the next topic. I mean, you all have a lot of experience of consuming open source, and many of you have a lot of experience of contributing open source. What do you think makes a high-quality open source project?
Well, I think that we should distinguish between community projects and corporate projects, because they are quite different. And I think it's misleading just to talk about one large open source group. And of course, the quality depends on the community or on the company. There are good open source projects and there are bad open source projects. And regarding the community, I would say it's about the experience, passion, and also honesty of the people. Whether they want to create great software for fun or for any kind of recognition, or whether they want to create something which gets some, say, market share, and they will milk money from the users who installed not from quality project.
I could certainly offer a couple of points that I had, and the first point as well is really just, you know, if this effort fills a void into what Jan had offered, if you remove a barrier to entry to the project and provide something that people want, you'll have an excellent outcome. And the fact that you can contribute, no one developer knows everything. There's just too much out there. And if you're able to do the collaboration side and get input from individuals, I mean, this is how Linus Torvalds did the original Linux kernel, is that he put it out there and let his friends contribute and add in and provide feedback, and he grew and expanded the code so that the first version of Linux would come out and it was actually usable, because he took it as far as he could based on what he thought, and then he was able to add to it based on input. So, and there's a lot of projects out there like that. And I think that's what makes it very high quality is the fact that you have, you can get so much input from people that have expertise in ways that you may not even realize.
Yeah, I think that's good because what you want is a project with a community, whether it's a like fully open source thing like a Eclipse Foundation project or an OpenNTF thing generally, or if it's just like a company puts it out as open source. You want either a community or general activity that's kind of to scale of the size of the project. So, you know, for example, if Linux only had Linus Torvalds committing to it currently, that would be a red flag. That's not the case. But if there's a small library that is cleanly designed and has issues are taken care of or just does what it needs to do, and that only has one person regularly committing to it, fine. And so, yeah, it is about that kind of like, if a person is saying, I'm the only contributor, but I take responses and deal with this stuff, and it's not so large a project that one person can't do it, that's perfectly good. Ideally what you want would be more than one potentially, but you really want to observe the community compared to the size and importance of the project. So if it's a large sprawling thing that some company put out and they said, Joe over here will maintain this and there's no way, that's not so good. But you kind of want to look for that match, which is admittedly a very vague metric. But that's kind of when you can. It's one of those like you can tell it when you see it sort of things, like whether it's healthy, whether there's activity, whether there are people talking about it and using it and contributing or discussing it. It kind of becomes apparent as you see different projects.
And I want to add something here to Jesse's sentence. I think one of the things for me to decide if it's a good or a high quality open source project is a simple question: does it solve my problem? And mostly as a developer, I have real small problems to solve. Sometimes I have big one, and for that I need also big projects. But there are projects out there, they do not need any maintainer anymore. I heard the story that def/null on Linux was never rewritten because it's final, it works. Like string utils is empty, is final, it works. So, and is it only because it's never changed because the API is final and it works? Is it for that a bad quality open source project because it doesn't have any changes? I don't think so, because I'm using utils is empty all the time. It's the same with def/null. So, and that's the thing. So I start always at this point: does it solve my problem? Does it solve my problem in a final, eternal way, or is it to pretend to solve my problem and maybe it will later do it? And is it a small project or a huge, large project? And as a project grows, it tends to be vulnerable, it tends to be not complete, and so on. And as a project grows, as it should also do the same with the community that is supporting this project. So string utils, I think one contributor who has done it 7 years before, okay, it's done. Linux without a community behind it, I don't think that everybody would install Linux because it's a huge project. It needs all these different contributors that are delivering all the stuff. And so I think you can have some kind of a measure about size, complexity, and problems that a project solves, and compare that to the community that is supporting the project, community that is using the project, and community that is willing to build their own business on that project.
I was thinking of another way that you can kind of get a bead on the health or seriousness of a project is kind of the do they dot the I's and cross the T's? So is that That is to say, do they have their licenses correct? And I am the IP manager, so do they have their licenses correct? Do they have, do they use dependencies reasonably? Are the changes they make, thought out? And these are, again, a little, some of them are vague where you could just see, is there a license file? Because you can find a GitHub repository, and if there's no license file, you're not allowed to use it. And so, that's one of those things where some of that depends on, and there are good kind of like leading indicators for that, and you can see that like if it's a project from the Apache Foundation or from Eclipse, it's going to have that stuff set. Whether or not it's still a great project, it's still like that's going to be clean. If it's just something somebody uploaded, and this has been a problem a number of times with NPM projects where it'll either be amateurish or hostile or something like that, where you can kind of tell like this doesn't, you kind of get a feeling of like this doesn't seem to be really properly thought out. This is, whether it's intentional or not, like this is just something somebody wrote a couple lines and said, here you go, and then it spread too far. What you really want to know is like, okay, is somebody going into this seriously? Have they thought this stuff out? Is it properly, again, properly licensed? Are the dependencies good? Like it doesn't, because you can go too crazy with that kind of thing. And so they're kind of just like little, it's analogous to code smell, where it's like, it's not incorrect, but it seems wrong. You can kind of pick that up, where it's like, seeing these things cleanly done, correctly done is a good sign that the person, at least initially, was very serious about doing this correctly. And so if you look out for those indicators, that can be a good sign for the project in general.
And I think you pick up a good area there where it also leads into documentation as well, coming back to what Bill was saying earlier about the ease of installing stuff. What do we think about documentation requirements for projects?
I mean, for me, my favorite documentation tool, and generally for developers, it's very easy, is Man. All the Man pages in Linux, for example, are fabulous. And they don't take a ton of time, but oh boy, are they helpful. And they're portable. And on every system they have it, it's standardized. Now, okay, so that's a larger effort. Even on smaller utility applications and OpenNTF style projects, a man page doesn't make sense. But having the basic components in there or a simple how-to guide goes a long way if you can adhere to some sort of a standard so that people know when they go in, it's already familiar. So if you can look at a how-to guide or some of the documentation that's somewhat relevant to what you're doing, you save the time of your potential customers, if you will, even though it may be freeware, it may not be, but and users, if you prefer, and allow them to just get what they want quickly, and that just creates confidence and a warmth towards the application, which just expands adoption, very quickly. So that may be something also just to consider. Versus say everybody having 20 different standards for documentation, and some people have X and some people have Y, and that makes it very difficult. So that may be something that's useful, but again, I know it's not relevant to every type of application.
Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. So a good open source project needs consumers and contributors. And I know we have a number of people here who are heavily involved in the contribution side. What can be done to ensure a healthy balance, and what support can companies offer and why should they? And what supports can an open source organization provide? Carsten, do you want to speak first on how you maintain enthusiasm for something like Domino JNA, which is quite heavily used?
Yes, I think the main point is that I'm using it in my own projects. So I have really motivation to work on the project, to extend it, add features I need, and maybe others need too. That's my main concern, and to get some positive feedback, of course. I hear a lot about developers using it, so that's of course very motivating. But I think it wouldn't be enough if there wasn't any real reason for me to use it in my projects and in our customer work. Because after all, the day is limited, time is limited, and you need to get some money for the rent.
Definitely. And talking of time being limited, God knows how, Jesse, you managed to keep on top of all the open source projects that you're involved with. How do you manage to keep a healthy balance?
So, I mean, the bulk of it ends up in the same category as Carsten was talking about, where like those are the things that I use for work. So NSS ODP tooling, the Open Liberty Domino runtime, the Jakarta EE on Domino stuff, that all comes from problems that I had to solve or wanted to solve for client work. Like, so, we ran into issues with, we don't want to use Wink. We want to use a better JAX-RS provider. So I did that. I am tired of using designers. So I wrote the NSF ODP tooling and it saved me time. And so like that gets into one of the ways that companies can offer support, which is that, if a company or an individual at a company has an open source project, like use it for your stuff and then make that open source project like the result of the work you're doing to improve your business. That doesn't apply to everything, but a lot of the time it applies to your complements. So if it's something that's not your core business, if putting it open source is not going to put you out of work, then you should make it open source if possible. And if there's an existing project that you can contribute to, like say, oh, my company can make lots of use of this and we have ways to improve it, then you can contribute back to an existing one. And so, the easiest way is to just make it part of your business. Like if it's something that you would want to do anyway or need to do anyway, then the work on the open source project kind of comes by default. So you could say, oh, well, I can make this open source. Like I gain nothing by not sharing it. So like that's kind of an easy way, and then like there are other ways as a individual or as an organization that you could say, oh, you have open source Fridays or whatever, where like a fifth of your time is just dedicated to working on open source projects if it's not necessarily what your normal job is. That's more of an active participation rather than a kind of like, oh, here's the stuff that came out of our work. Both of those are good, but I think that it's being the main user of your project and having lots of changes to make to it is kind of the default way to create that symbiotic relationship, because they're both you. And then your hope will be to kind of wrangle others into it as well.
Regarding Domino JNA, it started as a customer project for to access CAPI methods, and it grew over the time. So now we are 30 releases after this point in time, and you see it gets bigger and bigger. So I get back things from my customer work, and also it's quite motivating to see how developers are using it, and even at HCL I heard that some guys are using it and got feedback from the Keep team that is using it for the Keep tool base. So that's pretty interesting to see how this grows, how this develops.
Yeah. So concerning keeping enthusiasm, yes, it's use the things or develop the things you use in your company, in your covers your need, but at least the moment when the project grows, that in the manner that you really publish it, get access to it, you should also ensure that you handle right how other contributors can contribute to that. But you have already done new idea coming in the project. How handle that in a fair way so that really that keeps the enthusiasm running, because if you have your needs in a project, there are coming ideas from others willing to contribute, and that keeps really enthusiasm and keeps the project alive also.
I could try coming at this from a slightly different angle in that sometimes end users and consumers will confuse open source with mobile apps in a sense because they're small, independent. It doesn't have the name of Adobe or Microsoft or IBM or Intuit stamped on it. So they think that they're small, independent apps in that line. And it's very difficult to tell on the mobile side whether it's open source or not because you click, you go through the catalog or play, you download it and it installs. We know how to go behind the scenes and verify that information. So the point is to maintain enthusiasm and satisfaction with the customers. We know that there's a lot of stories around security and how independent apps can harvest data, sell that, and so forth. So if you have a clear message within a description of the application about what you're going to do, what kind of security measures are there, so that you show that you respect any user of the program, that's going to allow for increased satisfaction with your customers. And may very well, if you have integrity-minded developers and contributors, they're also going to appreciate that you have very clear messaging around the scope of the application, what the goals are, and how it's going to help people. And then if you have the integrity and that zeal, and you can foster enthusiasm that way and ensure that you're respecting your customers along the way. And separate a similar line between nefarious apps that engage in conduct that many of us might find untoward with their applications, and basically saying you're going to do something, but do something else completely on the back end. And there might be some fear around that.
Thanks. Christian, do you want to talk about what support you think an open source organization can provide?
Yes, I was thinking a little bit to condense all the statements here, and I first want to put out why has WebGate, company I work for, open sourced several projects, and we didn't make it by mistake, and we didn't make it when we had the project. We did start each project that we open sourced as an open source project by definition. And the reason was very simple, and is also today very simple when we open source projects. We want that others can use the things that we are doing, and we believe that open sourcing this shows our competence, shows our dedication, and shows our enthusiasm for the platform we are working on and solves a real world problem. And most time our problems that we are solving are problems that every other developer is also facing. So I'm not the guy who has much fun in charging developers that they can use my stuff. I want to empower developers that they can use things I have done to make their own money and to satisfy their customers. So if they are doing something very cool with Point4X pages, or they are doing something very cool with SmartNTF, I feel personally honored that they can do it. So that I want to lay out, and that's also the thing that keeps me personally enthusiastic about this. But as an open source organization, what can we do to support it? Jesse has laid out that a good open source project has some kind of a smell, of a code smell. And as an open source organization, especially as OpenNTF, we are very, very strong concerned in all this IP and license stuff. We do some kind of an IP check to figure out if the things that people are contributing are using the right dependencies, or are doing all the thing that makes open source such a valuable stuff, doing this thing right, like writing a license file or copy the license file, like having the notice file, because that's one thing we maybe are not aware of, but a part of the open source contract is also give owner to the people who have done the real hard job. So if you write down in a notice file, hey, I'm using from Apache Commons utils, or I'm using this and this, you are giving owner back to these people and telling them that they have done a great job and that you appreciate their work. And I think that's one of the things that we as an organization can do and will do. We will make sure that this attribution is going the right way. We will make sure that licensing is done in a way we understand that it should be. That's a huge part that Jesse Gallagher is doing at OpenNTF. And what we also try to do is some kind of a spirit of, as I said, some kind of recognition, of shout outs to people who are doing a great job, to make them visible, to point to projects. So maybe one thing at NWE, look, Collabs Fair, we had this discussion or this speech, what OpenNTF is doing, and I did a small shout out to Theo Hesselman, who has done an incredible application for the Nomad client, and I do it now again because I think his wine taste application is brilliant. It's nice. It's a cool stuff he has made, and I think that things as an organization that we should do to point people to solutions. If you are in love with someone, then you think this person is absolutely the best for your life, and you want to share all the cool stuff. And I think as an open source organization, we should do the same, because we should be a little bit at least in love with the things that our members and contributors are doing, because they are dedicating a part of their life, maybe a part of their business, and that's things that we are doing and can do and will do. And that's also a way how we can support. On the other hand, and I want to also point this out, we as an organization, but not as a paid organization, as a volunteer organization, we help also developers to learn new stuff. So when I think, when it comes to how to write a plugin, how to write a cool Java code and so on, OpenNTF has done a huge job. When it comes to automated build and testing, OpenNTF has done a huge job, because we have provided everything open source to the people, how you can do it. And we have showcased that it works. When it comes to how you can work as a team, I remember when ODA was built, I think there were 15 people involved that have worked together, and they have messed up their different Git branches and had at the beginning huge trouble to do it, and then they have learned how to work with Git together. And that's all things that we provide as an open source organization, or especially as a community. So, and I think that is something that we can make again and again and again to keep the momentum running.
Thanks. Well, I think we've come to about the end of the roundtable. So I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions. Thank all of our attendees for stopping by, and enjoy the rest of the factory tour. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.